Welcome to Count Me In. I'm your host, Adam Larson, and in today's episode, we're diving into the world of shareholder engagement with Jonathan Smalley, co-founder at Proximity. We'll uncover why strengthening shareholder engagement is more crucial than ever, and why it's imperative for navigating the upcoming political landscape. From climate change to the rising influence of retail shareholders, we'll explore the global factors impacting shareholder engagement and the shift towards digitalizing proxy voting. Jonathan shares valuable insights on bridging the gap in shareholder communication and the potential benefits for organizations. Get ready to gain a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities in shareholder engagement. Well, Jonathan, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today, and we're going to be talking about shareholder engagement, which is something not everybody touches necessarily, but it's a very important part of your organization, especially if you have a board or shareholders, if you're a public company. And so what makes strengthening shareholder engagement more critical now than ever for smoother investor relations, especially as we're getting into 2024 here as we're recording at the end of 2023? What makes that so important right now?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adam. I'd say it's more critical than ever, but I'd say it's been critical for quite a long time. But when we look at kind of what's behind us and what's ahead, there are some really big global factors that are not going away, that are continuing to kind of heat things up, if you like. And they are, I think as we head into 2024, also is I think it's the biggest political election year globally ever. Big elections in the US, India, South Korea, Mexico, likely to be one in the United Kingdom. And a lot of the factors actually are, that are going to impact political elections and going to be considerations when people go to the ballot box, are actually also transferable to the boardroom or to the annual general meeting hall. Things like climate change. It's not going to surprise people that is something that is extremely topical and is a key part of issuer shareholder engagement. Just this year, both inside the US and outside, more shareholder proposed climate proposals than last year. And there are groups that cite that as financially material to their investment decisions now. And not just people on the street, but, powerful, influential institutional investor groups have got together and made that determination. And they're not just asking issuers and obviously the regulators are also calling for disclosures. It's also their service providers that are asking to do more. They want net zero policies. They want better climate integration into things like voting policies. And another one that's been kind of heating things up for a long time now is say on pay. 94% now of S&P 1500 companies have a say on pay vote every single year. 10 years ago, that would have been about 50%. So it's a big increase. And even, I think this year that against recommendations from the leading two vote advisors were down, but, less against recommendations, but those resolutions got less support this year than last year. So that makes those contests quite frequent. And then I think, kind of linked to the climate change thing, you've got ESG versus increasing kind of anti-ESG, pretty polarized. And I think that's also something, as I sort of mentioned before, is going to also play out in political elections as well, not just in company elections. And then I'd say the big kicker to all of that is that we're just seeing year on year more votes, and particularly more votes from retail shareholders. Institutional shareholder voting has been quite high for a number of years now because of active ownership, because of stewardship codes, because of regulation. Retail kind of as a rule of thumb has always been 20, 25%, maybe in a contest a little bit higher than that. So there's clearly much more room for that to go into. And, we've got some brokers we're getting 30% year on year increase on retail shareholder voting. And that's coming at a time where we're going through millennials and Gen Zs inheriting anywhere between $68 to $84 billion. And millennials are at the moment the most likely generational group to vote. So big issues against the backdrop of a great wealth transfer, heading into a year that is going to be probably more politically charged than any we've seen across all the democratic countries in the world that are going to go to the polls. So I think engaging shareholders and having an efficient way for companies and shareholders to communicate back and forth is going to be more important than ever before, just because there's so much more coming. And I think we'll kind of get onto maybe the technology a little bit later. But if you look at the kind of legacy ecosystem about the way companies and shareholders communicate, we urgently need to upgrade that to deal with this, because it's a good thing for companies and shareholders to communicate back and forth. We should be allowing it efficiently and digitally. And if we don't, and we're not ready for what's coming, then there's going to be more negative headlines, I think, for companies to be worried about as those general meetings, debate and have voted on very, very important decisions for the company.
Yeah, I think it's great, how you outline all the different political factors, all the things happening around the world that are causing more and more shareholders to become more engaged. And before we get to the technology piece, maybe you could elaborate a little more about the importance of that communication between shareholders and the organization and how it can impact a company's overall performance and even reputation.
Yeah, starting with the reputational piece, that's it's pretty easy to talk about the downside sometimes because that's the thing that creates headlines.
Mm-hmm.
Creates headlines when results, challenged, right? When there's uncertainty about the results. And, we saw a fairly infamous case a few years ago at the P&G meeting, votes counted 3 times and it was a different result every time. And you're like, how could that be, right? And that was very expensive both for the company. It was an activist situation. It was expensive anyway for the campaign, as well as casting doubt on the whole underlying result. But, we also see that where it's maybe not just a mistake, but it's the fact that the issuer has kind of got something wrong. The one that comes up in the UK, has come up several times, is Sports Direct, which is like the kind of UK equivalent to Dick's Sporting Goods, right? But it's a household name. It's a consumer business, but they've been in the headlines for all sorts of the wrong reasons. That revolt against the CEO and the principal owner. It's been couldn't appoint an auditor for a period of time. So I think having good shareholder engagement can, in many ways, keep companies out of the headlines, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think kind of going back to the question though, how can it positively impact kind of a company's performance and reputation? I think it's important to have a loyal base of shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's especially true for consumer businesses. That can be a big plus, and I think how many people have invested in a crowdfunding scenario where they've also using that product or service. And that actually seeps into other areas, right? That's, if, you can easily see somebody holding a stock in their brokerage account because they like the products or services they're consuming. And loyal shareholders generally mean you've got a resilient base. In the prosperous times, you could take that for granted, but when we go through other parts of the economic cycle, having a kind of loyal shareholder base is something that can help make the underlying share price resilient. And that's both true in terms of retail shareholders and institutional investors. A lot of the institutional investors are extremely engaged, extremely active owners, doing thousands of engagements a year, and more likely to make a positive determination on companies that engage shareholders regularly and in meaningful ways. And in terms of kind of tracking that to performance, it's been proven, lots of studies about how the importance of an outside perspective of active owners, particularly active institutional investors, can be to helping the board and management deal with kind of what I'd call moments that matter. On any given year, what might be on the slate for a general meeting might be fairly boilerplate, but there will be those big moments that matter, those big dilemmas where it's important to have a way to very efficiently engage your shareholder base so that you can get the right outcome for the company. And so I think all those 3 things kind of go together. It's hard to make an argument that not engaging your shareholders and having that kind of easy way to access them is ever going to be a bad thing.
Well, and I imagine with the shifting of the wealth, as you mentioned, it's no longer just a bunch of very high wealthy people with making their voices heard because they're a shareholder and they may have more shares than others, but because so many people and the launch of many different apps and stuff like that, more the common person is having that access to those shares and being able to buy stock. I think of organizations like in the US, the Green Bay Packers. They're a share, you can, as a fan, you can go buy a share in the team and go to the share meeting at the stadium. So it's becoming more common for people. So when you have that open communication, it's going to be a double-edged sword. People will be excited about things, but then you'll also hear their voices when they're not happy about things. But it helps you grow as an organization as well, I imagine.
Yeah, and I think the last thing any company or organization for that matter wants is for that dissent to play out publicly in either a general meeting or in the result of a general meeting. It makes sense to have those conversations early. It has those conversations throughout the year. And I think as we look to kind of digitize, not just proxy voting, but investor relations in general, it does open up the ability to not just have a once a year kind of en masse engagement with all your shareholders, but to actually easily engage the opinions and views of everybody. And that's just about kind of risk management, if you like, or on the flip side, looking for where they might have input that you hadn't already thought about, outside perspectives. Everybody, I think, appreciates the power of, diverse skills, diverse opinions. There can be nothing more diverse than getting the opinion of all your shareholders, whether it's the biggest, most powerful asset managers in the world, down to people with handfuls of stocks in their brokerage accounts or pension funds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you've been hinting at things like technology and that there's huge gaps in how people communicate. Like I know when I get notices in the mail for voting for certain shares I have in my 401k, it's like this mailer with this huge booklet and you're like looking through trying to figure out, I don't even know what I'm looking at here. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what are some of the huge gaps that are happening right now that are hampering like this engagement. And then we can get into talking about what are some solutions that people can have.
Yeah, sure. I mean, everybody knows the mail, right? The proxies in the mail. Almost everybody's got one of those things, and it's probably on the kitchen table somewhere. The way I think about the technology gaps is in two kind of big buckets. Firstly is structural, and then secondly is more the modalities. By structural, and this is kind of where we initially started out, several years ago on the proximity journey, was the way that kind of shares are held through the ecosystem. It was not designed, it was not optimized for communication. It probably wasn't even an afterthought. The way shares are held is all designed to kind of make efficient things like settlement and the holding of securities. So, I always kind of describe it like looking at the layers of an onion. Right at the center, you've got the central securities depositories from the US, the DTCC, but, name any country around the world, it's a similar type organization. Who owns what at a central level, but only who owns what of the next layer in the onion. And then the next layer in the onion knows who the next set of, intermediaries are. So between any kind of issuer at the center of the onion and an investor, there can be 6, 7, 8 intermediaries or service providers. Now, they're all adding value to each other. That's why it exists. And but it's optimized for something else. It's not optimized for communication. And then when we go and try and lay on top of that, things like proxy voting or any kind of form of investor communication, that's when we get problems because they're all having to communicate through each other. And that means things like, transmission of information is delayed, can be distorted, it erodes decision time, and it generally makes the whole thing for the two end users, the companies and the shareholders, less transparent than it should be. So they're not communicating directly, they're having to communicate through this kind of quite labyrinth-like ecosystem. Now, that's the first problem. We've got to, we can't do anything about our structure. It exists for very good reasons and very technical reasons as well as just reasons about trying to keep the marketplace efficient and cheap for people to hold and buy shares. But we can, with modern technology, do something to kind of, move ourselves out from having to navigate directly through it. The second big bucket is all about modalities. And there is like a weird and wonderful mix of the way proxies get voted throughout the world.
Yeah.
You mentioned mail, but I think it would surprise people that at some point in a vote journey from a shareholder to issuer, it's almost certainly being put on a spreadsheet and attached in an email and sent from one party to another. Now, you might think there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but when you're doing it at scale and when you think how kind of important that vote might be to the outcome of a meeting for one of the biggest companies in the world, or, even a small, medium-sized company that's contributing meaningfully to the economy in which that company exists, you can easily appreciate how there's a margin for error there.
Yeah.
And that margin for error means some votes are not getting counted or some votes are just being cast the wrong way, and that distortion shouldn't happen. It's inefficient. And you could take it to extremes. I remember doing a project many years ago in an Eastern European country, and the dominant way shares get voted was through a paddle board. So you would have people have to attend the meeting physically. They'd have to pre-register a number of shares, and they would receive a paddle board with a number on. And when the chair of the meeting would call out the resolution, they would raise the paddle for or against. And to prepare for the meeting, they would have to take all the votes from all of their underlying clients, whether that be intermediary clients or ultimately directly from some investors. They would have to put those votes into unique sequences. And then if they had 10 unique sequences across the meeting, they'd have to send 5 people because one person can only hold 2 paddle boards at any one moment in time.
Wow.
And this wasn't even that long ago. Now, that's obviously an extreme example, but all those modalities create this kind of very complex ecosystem that it's hard to get shares voted. We're talking Excel, we're talking mail. In some very developed markets, we're still talking about some vote instructions going over fax machines. We're talking about physical attendance, powers of attorney. So if you then take the structure and the fact that we're using so many kind of legacy communication tools, there's a reason why, investors are not having to vote many, many days before the real deadline. There's a reason why it's very hard for investors to work out, did the vote get to where it should have got to and get counted? And there's a reason why issuers are going, where are the votes until the very last minute? Because there's so much friction in that ecosystem, so many different people involved and so many different communication modalities or methods. It takes a while to get that information to them. So they're the big gaps. And I think layer on top of that, like I said, every country is slightly different.
Yeah.
And it's also that nuance that makes it fairly difficult then to make meaningful progress quickly, right? But, I'm a big believer that lots can be done. And I think we've seen lots of progress over the last few years. And certainly that's Proximity's mission, is people shouldn't have to worry about that stuff. We should be optimizing the experience for companies and shareholders. And we should be doing a better job as an industry about making their experience tangibly and meaningfully better.
Yeah. I mean, if we can make foldable glass phones, like that Samsung phone, if we can make those things, we should be able to make shareholder relations and proxy voting so much simpler than it is. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that digital transformation for proxy voting, and maybe a little bit what you guys are doing to help bridge that gap that you just went over, because I think that's important to understand. How can that gap be bridged and what people can do to take the next step?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just remarking on the experience for a retail and institutional investor, I think link it to kind of our earlier discussion about kind of how to, engage retail shareholders more meaningfully. Often historically, we've given retail shareholders the same tools that institutions have had. And they're institutional investors that are professional and resourced and have, corporate governance professionals and lawyers look over this stuff, You and I don't have those resources, nor do we have that time. So giving me a proxy in the mail is not going to get me to participate in the same way or to the same level as the institutional investor community does. So it's all about also thinking about how do we adapt the experience in terms of kind of how can we improve things and how have we improved things. For us, it's been firstly about kind of reimagine the process and turn it around. So what was happening, companies would decide what the general meeting agenda was going to be. They'd send that to their service provider of choice, who'd then send that on to the kind of first layer of banks, who'd send it on to the next layer of banks, who'd ultimately find its way to the investor. And then the investor would vote, and it would have to kind of go back through the layers all the way to the issuer. What we said is let's take out the layers as the first step. Let's take the data we need from those financial intermediaries that we all hold our shares through and all institutional investors hold their investments through, and figure out the pathway between an issuer and an investor. So that as soon as we handle the information, it's going all the way to the shareholder straight away with their confirmed reconciled voting amount. We're not having to work that out after the fact.
Yeah.
And there's a split between some markets whereby, your right to vote was crystallized before you got the proxy. And there's some markets in the world where actually you get the votable agenda before your entitlement is determined. So, our solution is kind of compatible with both. That means we can get the information to the shareholder much faster. So straight away, we give them extra decision time. And because we're taking the meeting information directly from the company or from their agent, we're not relying on third-party data vendors. And we did a survey this year. 25 to 33% of investors were saying that the meeting agenda they ultimately got was either distorted or misdata. So, and the most common reason was like the detail was stripped away. So it was very hard for me to figure out ultimately, was I voting on the right thing? I was missing the information I needed to make a decision. So our approach means we get the information faster. We give them kind of golden source data that nobody else needs to touch. That means they can then vote back much sooner. And because when they vote back, we can give that directly to the issuer because we've created that kind of digital ownership pathway. We don't have to send the vote back through any other layers in the system. So the issuer is actually now has the potential to get the vote much earlier than they historically would have got it. And therefore, if that doesn't match what they're expecting or their engagement that they'd had prior or their investor relations communications, there's more time to do something about it. There's more time to have another engagement, another conversation, which in our opinion can only be positive. And kind of a final benefit of that is because we've simplified the process, the companies can confirm for the first time to the shareholders that we got the vote got counted, the vote's going to be confirmed in the meeting. That kind of missing feedback is kind of an inherent kind of pain point and efficiency of the old way of doing it, because it was so hard to communicate through the layers and through so many different methods. It was impossible to finally confirm back the vote got counted. Yeah. And kind of results is important, kind of, what were the results? I mean, when we did the very first minimum viable product of Proximity many years ago, we were able to give kind of 9 extra days decision time. And the kind of typical calendar for a general meeting is about a calendar month, maybe maximum 2 calendar months, depends on the market, depends on the company. So 9 days is very meaningful. For an institutional investor, they need to get the meeting information confirmed before they go off and do the research and decide how to vote. Many of them have levels of automation around that, but many of them also have the automation and have a very diligent review process. How are we going to vote at this company that we have a very sizable, meaningful investment in as a serious business firm? Give them 9 extra days, they can do a more thorough job. And for retail investors like you and I don't have a ton of time to vote my proxies, but if you can give me more time, that's surely only going to be helpful to drive my participation up, as well as if you can give me a better experience as well, a more tailor-made kind of retail experience. And it's not just shareholders that stand to gain, as I kind of mentioned, for issuers. They don't have to wait until the very last minute to get the votes. And that's a kind of inherent inefficiency of the current system. They can get the votes as soon as they're cast. They can see, is that going to meet quorum? They can see if that matches their IR conversations or their engagements. And they can see if it spells trouble. So they've got time to do something about it. And trouble is, my shareholders don't agree with the decisions we're making. So I might need to go and speak to them. And again, I think that can only be a good thing. So really, simplifying the process at its core and optimizing the experience just has benefits for everybody. And that's kind of that speaks to our mission.
Yeah, it allows for more time to make better decisions, because if you get something in the last moment because of delays or the mailers or whatever, you don't have as much time to make a more informed decision. So you're allowing to make better and informed decisions, which in essence helps the organization in the long run because you can vote with a more informed decision. So have you seen in your research as you've worked with organizations, is there a direct correlation between good shareholder relations and the company's financial performance or market perception? Is there a direct correlation between those things?
Yeah, like for proximity, it's probably too early.
Okay.
So we've been in business for 3.5 years now.
Yeah.
Progressively scaled up during that time. We have, in some markets, now 70% of institutional votes coming through our platform. So I think now we have that data about levels of engagement, levels of voting. You can then start to track that against financial performance. But, obviously, there's many different elements that go into kind of shareholder engagement over and above proxy, and obviously many different things that can happen to a company's financial performance. So it does take a kind of careful data analysis for us to do. I think the most comprehensive study I've read was one by one of the big consultancy firms. I think it was Deloitte. I think it was kind of a study of studies. I think they looked at sort of 60 odd studies and 120 relationships directly. And I think, their conclusion was fairly unanimous, right? That, good shareholder engagement and good governance, particularly variables like board independence, board diversity, oversight, the kind of ownership structure, when those things were good, those companies performed good, both financially and non-financially.
Yeah.
And, I think most people can understand how having, active institutional investors giving outside perspectives is going to be good for a company, how having a board that's independent and diverse with diverse skills and backgrounds is going to be good, and how having a kind of a remuneration policy that, rewards management and rewards the CEO and the company as well, but also thinks about how to incentivize in the harder times as well. So like one of the things is, when you go through a different economic cycle, giving management stock options all the time is obviously not going to incentivize them, because sometimes there's just nothing they can do. So, I think levels of engagement and good governance, kind of that comprehensive study was kind of, overwhelmingly tied strongly to financial and non-financial performance. Isolating that specifically for how many people voted at my general meeting, how engaged my retail shareholders are, I think it's too early to say.
Yeah.
But as we kind of get data and easier access to the data, as we kind of get rid of some of those legacy communication modalities where it's very hard to kind of then sort through all that data if actually shares were voted and tabulated from 12 different methods. I think it will be easier to answer your question kind of more decisively. But I think the underlying factors kind of speak for themselves in terms of, should a company do it or not?
As we go into an increasingly technological world where we become more and more reliant on it, have there been concerns about security when it comes to proxy voting in this manner that you've been discussing? Obviously when they're doing the mailers, they don't know that it's getting to the right place. They don't know who's sending it back. Like there probably wasn't very much security in the old way of doing it either. But have there been concerns brought up about the security when it comes to doing this type of process?
Our customers hold us to a very high bar in terms of, due diligence, in terms of information security, because, what we're dealing with is very important, but I think you kind of, touched on some of the areas where, provided we're serious about what we do and we take all the all the best practice around there around cybersecurity, information security. We hold ourselves to a high standard in terms of auditing, and whoever does it, whoever's ultimately digitizing proxy voting does the same. We're infinitely better off than the kind of world that we've inherited. People might think there's a natural resilience to paper and Excel and many different kind of manual methods, but actually that's where you're more likely to have an error or an issue or an oversight or something that just doesn't get there. I think you have many more options when things are, digitized on platforms in databases that can be backed up, that can have, several levels of resiliency to them built in by design. But it's like any election or there is the potential for bad actors to become involved, as we've maybe seen in some of the political elections of years gone by.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you have to, as long as you're taking up to the highest standards, you do the best you can. Because if hackers are hackers, and there'll always be hackers, but you do the best you can with security, in the midst of all that.
Yeah, and I think for companies, it's as you would expect, the general meeting is a very, very important event, and it's a very high risk event in general for most COSECs and most investor relations professionals, for the CFO, for the directors, for the CEO, as you'd expect. So they take it seriously. We take it seriously, and I think the rest of the financial community takes this bit of the industry, proxy voting, very, very seriously. But we're in an infinitely better place if we have things accurately digitized in modern systems than we do by having it strewn across legacy methods. There will always be bad actors. Our job is to be resilient against them.
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up the conversation, what's some advice you could give to companies that they should be doing now to prepare for future challenges? And if they're thinking about switching proxy voting to this type of platform that you've been discussing, like yours, what should they be looking for?
Yeah, I think the first piece of advice is that it's not a big switch that needs to be pressed. We can still, the ecosystem can still support all of the methods today. There is just a new way to do this, and over time, the old methods will slowly fade away, particularly things like mail, particularly things like fax. You're just going to see less of that. I think the other kind of what I would call like fake electronic will be kind of slower to hit the wayside. But, using a platform like Proximity is completely compatible with the old way of doing it as well. It's just that over time, you're going to see more votes coming through a platform like ours than you do through some of the old methods. So it doesn't need to be that big move, and kind of linked to my kind of prior comments, we understand it's a kind of high risk event. So doing a big bang migration from one way of doing it, which, for all of its flaws, has kind of worked in inverted commas for the past decades, to a completely new way is also probably not the right way for many companies. So a simple adoption of a digital voting platform that can provide a kind of highway through to your end investors can start as just a new channel, right? And then over the fullness of time can become the dominant channel. That's kind of what we're seeing in some of the markets that we're most progressed in. As soon as we kind of get over that 50% of share cap voted to our platform, that is a real tipping point for many issuers. So I think that's the first thing is it doesn't need to be that big, scary, big bang migration that, almost everybody in the corporate world is slightly apprehensive of for understandable reasons. It can just be about giving yourself additional optionality, which immediately brings benefits. So I think that's the major thing to kind of navigate through this, and to do that now. The big factors at the top of our conversation, I think everyone can appreciate on not going away. So it's never been more important to engage with all shareholders, from the biggest institutional investors in your companies right through to the retail shareholders that are showing more and more appetite for engagement than they ever have.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I encourage our listeners to check out the links in the show notes if you want to learn more about Proximity or connect with Jonathan. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.